Frank the farmer was overjoyed to discover that his horse was expecting. It indicated that he was about to acquire another horse, which, if it was a good horse, might result in further financial prosperity. The time was almost here. After months of waiting, the mayor was about to deliver the foal. Strangely enough, despite having a huge stomach, it refused to give birth. Frank made the decision to obtain an ultrasound at the neighborhood vet. The moment the veterinarian viewed the ultrasound, he alerted the police. The cops informed the vet that they would arrive right away when he called them. More than simply a veterinarian was required to help this animal. There was plainly something weird going on in this horse's stomach, and it needed surgery. It might even be a matter of life or death. When the cops eventually showed up, they assisted the veterinarian in tranquilizing the now nearly lifeless huge horse. However, the police did not assist the vet, they also visited Frank. "Sir, you must accompany us, it's critical." Frank experienced shock. What was wrong with the horse? Frank responded to inquiries about himself and the horse he'd ridden since he was a child. After finishing all the inquiries, he heard something coming from the operating room. "This is unbelievable," the vet exclaimed. But what exactly did the horse's internal examination reveal that so shocked the doctor? Frank's horse had been carrying a foal for about a year now. Frank was desperate for a second horse, and because he adored his current horse, Martha, so much, he made the difficult decision to ensure that Martha could give birth to a foal. Frank needed to locate a certified person to lawfully impregnate his horse. He searched for someone who could do this legally for months without success. Frank questioned whether he would have to concede that his dream was unrealistic and considered getting a horse instead. But eventually, after months of looking, Frank discovered the right man. Due to his prompt availability, he stood in front of Frank's home within days to ensure Martha became pregnant. Frank was eagerly anticipating the moment Martha would give birth. Even though the procedure had been drawn out and slow, Frank eventually succeeded. Frank requested a first ultrasound from the veterinarian after a couple of weeks to determine whether Martha was truly pregnant. Following the ultrasound, the veterinarian gave the results. When the horse was examined by the veterinarian, both the animal and its foal appeared to be in good health, but things did not turn out as expected later in the pregnancy. At first, Martha struggled to get as much sleep as she could before becoming pregnant. On top of that, Frank was no longer able to accompany her on walks in the stables, which she had truly enjoyed doing. Frank, however, was unable to determine why this was the case. Martha's agitation increased as the pregnancy progressed. Since the veterinarian assured him that this was typical, Frank believed it would soon be over. However, the week before she was due to give birth to her tiny foal, she hit her breaking point. Martha resisted giving birth despite Frank making all the necessary preparations to ensure a peaceful delivery. Frank had no choice but to call the veterinarian, but he was asked questions he didn't anticipate. Frank was questioned by the veterinarian about Martha's specific behavior. She was first restless, but now she hardly moved, according to Frank. Frank's responses astonished the vet, who then informed Frank that Martha needed to be properly laid out on the ground. The veterinarian stated that Martha needed to be thoroughly stretched out since it might be time for her to give birth to a new foal. But Martha wasn't exactly simple to push because of how hostile she seemed. Frank was concerned that his horse would attack him. Was doing this really a good idea, he wondered. But what if she actually attacked Frank? That scenario could not have a happy ending for Frank or his horse, but there had to be another option. The veterinarian advised Frank that doing this was the only surefire method to ensure the survival of both his horse and her baby. Frank took sure to approach Martha quietly after learning that. When he was nearby, he made sure to place himself correctly to ensure that Martha would not feel any discomfort during everything she went through. The veterinarian requested Frank to feel Martha's stomach after he had properly stretched her out. Maybe there was a tiny bulge that he missed early in the pregnancy. Frank searched carefully, and what he discovered astonished him. He actually noticed a small protrusion that he'd never seen before. What did this signify, though? What about his horse? Frank quickly inquired as to Martha's safety from the doctor. However, the vet's response did not really provide much solace. The veterinarian's tone abruptly altered, and all he said was, "I need to do an ultrasound. I'm coming right now." Frank was instructed to calm down by the vet. He promised to arrive in 30 minutes. However, the veterinarian did not anticipate such issue. Even getting to Frank's place presented a hurdle. The vet got detained in traffic for a lot longer than she anticipated, because she was unaware that it was actually rush hour. For Martha to have the best chance of giving birth to her baby, the veterinarian realized she needed to get to the horse as soon as possible. Frank, who was becoming increasingly anxious, suggested that one of his pals bring a motorcycle to pick up the veterinarian. She may then arrive as quickly as possible. The veterinarian agreed to this plan, so she left to return to her office while awaiting a ride from one of Frank's closest friends. A few minutes later, they arrived at Frank's ranch after Frank's friend picked up the veterinarian from her office. Martha was completely immobile as the veterinarian began her inspection. But as the veterinarian approached, she started to move once more. In order to ensure that Martha was no longer a threat to her or Frank, the veterinarian needed to sedate her. However, sedating this horse was not as simple. Any assistance was needed by the veterinarian. Frank and his companion kept their distance from Martha in the hopes that she would stop acting aggressively as she became more and more hostile. However, it wasn't the case. The veterinarian was aware that she had no other choices. The vet could use stronger medications that they could, but there were risks involved. Martha and her foal might not have made it out of this alive. Frank was asked by the doctor what he desired. Frank couldn't decide between the options. It was quite difficult to decide. Frank was aware that if he made the wrong decision, this might go terribly wrong. After much thought, he chose to follow his emotions rather than his rational mind. Frank gave the vet permission to administer stronger medications because he was aware that Martha needed to be sedated in order for her to deliver her baby successfully. As Martha became increasingly hostile, they initially needed to get to safety. Frank and his companion were told to leave the stables carefully by the vet, but Martha was less than enthusiastic about the suggestion. Frank was hesitant to leave her in this situation because she became even more violent than before. Was it worth it? Martha appeared to be both restless and in pain. For her own health, it was best to have her put to sleep as soon as possible. Frank, therefore, left more soon than he had intended. The vet could now perform her duties. The veterinarian prepared the medications and sedated Martha while Frank and his companion were away. She waited till she was asleep for a while before beginning to get ready for the ultrasound she was about to do. Both Frank and the vet were under tension during these minutes. Was Martha experiencing a difficult situation? The ultrasound wasn't as simple to perform as it first appeared, because Martha wasn't in the best posture, because she was restless. Frank was instructed to help the veterinarian and stretch the animal into a favorable position. The ultrasonography procedure could then be completed by the veterinarian. The veterinarian's tone shifted as she conducted the ultrasound. It gradually shifted from being upbeat to being negative. Frank was aware of this, but he feared that he would distract the doctor. Later, he regretted not approaching her sooner. The veterinarian informed Frank that she had an urgent phone call to make after spending several minutes examining the ultrasound. Frank, though, was unaware of the vet's intended contract. At first, Frank became anxious. Were his horses okay? The veterinarian reassured Frank that his horses were in good health, but advised Martha to take some time off before giving birth to her foal. Frank nodded in agreement and followed the veterinarian inside his ranch. But after a short while, he heard an odd noise at his ranch. Frank overheard the police approaching. Yet why? He initially had no idea what was going on, but eventually he understood the vet had called the cops. Frank, though, was still puzzled as to why. She had phoned them. The vet then gave Frank an explanation of the circumstances. The vet discovered something that wasn't supposed to be in the horse's belly, and she informed Frank that his horse needed surgery. She now only employed a basic sedative, therefore she needed assistance from the local police, with tools to complete the surgery and adequately sedate Martha. Frank realized what was going on and soon became calm. He immediately allowed the police officers to carry out their duties on his land. Frank, however, could not believe what the policeman said to him when the officer approached him. The policeman said, "Sir, you must accompany us. We need to get some information from you." Frank was puzzled by this. What made them want to interrogate him? Nothing he did was incorrect. He chose to respond to the inquiries. However, in order to end the suffering as he had nothing to conceal, the officers began by posing straightforward questions. Frank had to affirm that he was the person they were speaking with and that the horse in the stables belonged to him. Frank thought it was weird that the subsequent questions dwelled into further detail. They wanted to know these things, but why? They inquired as to how his mare initially became pregnant. Frank said that he spoke with a specialist who could assist him in this. He also mentioned that he checked the expert's background to ensure that everything he did was legal. Frank even provided the police his sources to ensure that they knew what he had done was legal, that they understood by the police, who acknowledged that everything was lawful, but insisted they still wanted additional information from him. Frank was surprised when the policeman pulled something out of his luggage. The police officer's mugshot was distinct from that of possible criminals. They inquired as to whether Frank could recognize anyone in the images. Frank experienced shock after seeing numerous photos, but then he recognized a face. The expert! He was a suspect, but why? Frank was aware of no criminal activity on his part. Frank started to worry more and more. What was done to this man's horse? Did Martha's inability to give birth naturally have anything to do with it? Shortly later, the cops gave a situational explanation. Although he was an authority on horses, this individual also had a history of illegal medical practices because he frequently experimented with novel medical procedures on many species of animals. The police were already looking for him, and it informed veterinarians what he does. On the ultrasound, the veterinarian saw two odd objects, one of which was a medical chip in Martha's abdomen. When the vet saw it, he understood he had to notify the police. Due to the fact that the chip was produced illegally by the expert who assisted Frank, the authorities were searching for it. The cops assisted the vet throughout the procedure to extract the chip and identify it as coming from the expert. Not only did they take out the chip, but they also were delighted to assist in the birth of a brand new foal. That was not your typical young stallion. The second thing the veterinarian noted on the ultrasound was that this foal was a unique specimen that might be extremely valuable. The vet couldn't believe his eyes when Martha had delivered her foal following the surgery. He had never before encountered such a remarkable creature. Frank was informed by the veterinarian that the likelihood of this occurring was 1 in a million. Frank named the foal Nuri. He intended to keep it. After going through everything together, he realized that he and his horse shared a unique link that he would never be able to break. After all, the cops also succeeded in locating the specialist and taking him into custody. Frank could finally go on to live a happy life on his property with his 2 horses.